The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales Radio Show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic, and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales Radio Show with me, Charles Christian. Another big interview this week, so I'll crack on straight away and introduce our guest. In the hot seat is Norwegian academic and non-fiction author Terje Simonsen. He describes himself as a historian of ideas, specialising in the esoteric and occult, and is the author of the book A Short History of Nearly Everything Paranormal. You'll find a link to his book on our website. Terje says he's fascinated by so-called magical phenomena such as telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition and psychokinesis, and has been exploring the scientific basis for them and whether parapsychology can explain them as part of an expanded human consciousness. Our secret powers, if you like. It's fascinating stuff. Here's the interview. Right, now the first question, now you've got a PhD, you've got doctor before your name, so you're an academic, but you've got an interest in the paranormal, and it does seem to be still a big thing in academic circles that academia is very sensible and anything to do with paranormal is just sort of pseudoscience and not to be taken lightly. So give us a bit of background. How did you get into it on a serious level?
Well, as you said, this has been a private interest for me since I was a young boy, really, and also when I was a young man. But then I came to the university, and the guy who became my mentor, he had a PhD or even more than that on a German mystic called Jakob Böhme. And that's history of ideas. So it's not, say, going into whether or not these things are real, but to see how they have been somehow been perceived and what influence they have got on thinkers and culture and so. But of course, giving attention to a subject, it's also somehow giving it value. Yes. And my mentor, his personal opinions about this he was not very much into parapsychology. He was, say, a scholar in occultism and esotericism. But at the same time, he told me about some paranormal experiences he had himself. And but he said, until there is a kind of theoretical framework that somehow can integrate these kind of experiences in a meaningful whole, it will just be, say, diverse and sundry observations and strange fact and so. So what was lacking really, he thought, was that there was some of overarching theory or, say, a explanatory model that could make sense of all these reports, because they are so numerous. But as long as they can be ascribed to coincidence or having slept not so well or taken LSD or something, then you can escape for taking them seriously. But if you got a theoretical framework that somehow can catch and say frame these things in a meaningful way, then it's a kind of different story. So somehow that was kind of starting point. I wrote a thesis about anthroposophy, Rudolf Steiner and that kind of things. And, it just went on from there, really. And if you go into parapsychology, you will see that there are quite a number of stellar scientists that are interested and really, say, believe in or are convinced that these phenomena are real. For instance, we have in Cambridge Brian Josephson. He is professor in physics, and he won the Nobel Prize in physics for superconductivity in 1973. So he's convinced that, for instance, telepathy is a objectively occurring phenomenon.
Your background, you said you'd been interested from when you were very young, as a child. What was the element from that? What did you come from a family where they had traditions, or told ghost stories, or some background like that?
Yeah, but in a way that I discovered later. But what started out was just kind of, kids are interested in magic stuffs and fairy tales and so. But also I went to a Christian youth club, and some of my trusted friends in that youth club told me about strange things, say answered prayers and that kind of things, and also telepathic experiences, communicating with family members, other part of the world, and that kind of things. And I had not, the people I trusted telling these things. So, but again, how is these things to be explained? If you are a Christian, then you can say, God made this happen. Mm-hmm. But some Christians are very skeptical of these things. They say it's the devil that somehow will tempt you, because there are warnings about doing occult stuff especially in the Old Testament. So then you have one say it's coming from God, and other Christians say it comes from the devil, and you have the skeptics say it's all nonsense, and I find that neither of these three approaches were fruitful, but then, as I said, going into parapsychology, then you get some kind of perspectives from both laboratory research and theoretical frameworks from quantum physics and so and so. So it was a long process, really. But the first, say, experiential meeting with this was in this Christian youth club.
Mm-hmm. And just jumping on to a point you said there with moving on into the quantum physics, a lot of people do talk about quantum physics having some kind of relationship with what we might broadly call the paranormal. But I suspect a lot of them don't really understand what quantum physics is. And, quantum's one of those magic words people use. Can you explain a bit more of that?
Well, yes. So where to start? We usually have a quite rigid perception of what is space and what is time, and somehow they are points of reference for all we experience. But in quantum physics, those, say, common sense perceptions of space and time are not necessarily taken for granted. Rather, the opposite. There are lots of experiments. I can go into a couple of them if you'd like me to, but just to have mentioned that there are experiments that clearly indicates that our common sense perception of time is not basically real. And also our common perception of space is also not basically valid. It's valid, of course, in our day-to-day experience, but it's not how it really is. So, of course, we do not know for certain from the outset that quantum physics, say, perceptions about time and space necessarily have consequences also for consciousness and these phenomena. But at least there is the opening for that might be a possibility. And of course, so then you have to make experiment and test that hypothesis in the laboratory, which has been done by quite rigid researchers. I could drop quite a lot of names, but I mentioned, Brian Josephson, but the most famous parapsychologist today is probably Dean Radin. And also last year passed away Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Kary Mullis, and he also had been part of parapsychological experiments and was quite convinced that here we have dealing with real phenomenon.
So just give us a little example then of how our perception of time and space are not correct if we start taking the quantum physics view?
One of the most classical experiments that was performed by a guy first from Berkeley in University in the US. His name is Johann Clauser, and he was part of what is called the fundamental physics group, kind of what you can say a think tank. Who wanted to know what consequences do quantum physics have for, say, our view of ourselves, of the world and of consciousness. And he made an experiment. He is not so famous for that, because the relay button was taken up by a French researcher, Alain Aspect. And so to just give a, say, basic description of the experiment, if you make two electrons collide, and then you get a kind of reaction where there is created two photons, particles of light, and because they are created in that collision, then they are called twin photons, and they hurtle off in opposite direction at the speed of light, because they are particles of light. But what is really wondrous is if you measure these particles when they have moved away from each other, say they have many kilometers, and you measure one of those particles is moving to the right, then you will simultaneously be able to measure the other particle, the other twin of those pairs moving to the left. And if, say, the first of them, those is moving up, then you will see the other twin moving down. So you got a mirror, opposite mirror reflection of the movements. And that is even if they are many kilometers apart, and that is proven experimentally many times, at least with 3 different cyclotrons in the places in the world. So clearly those photons, from our common sense perception of space, they are totally separate. But in quantum physics, and it's experimentally proven, they are still connected and acting as they should be, really one. So how can you explain that? That is, of course, difficult, but it is like that, and it's experimentally proven. So that cannot be, say, that is beyond discussion these days. I have read several physicists, they are not in doubt that this is the case. But of course, what you can say, the point is then, do this have any implication for our, say, view of consciousness? And some physicists said that it has, and some others do not agree on that. So the debate is not whether or not to say,
So putting it into layman's term, and please feel to slap me down if I've got this wrong, with those two particles, what you're saying is it's possible to be simultaneously in 2 different places.
Yeah, that is one way of putting it. Or we can say what appears to be, say, 2 different particles is really, from one perspective, still a unity.
And I say, how does that work with the difference with time then? I mean, obviously we have a fairly unidirectional view of time, that we're starting now, what happened an hour ago is in the past and will never return, and we're progressing forward into the future, and we just go in time's arrow goes in one direction. How does that gel then with the quantum view?
And time is even more tricky there. It's different approaches you can take on that, but it was an Australian experiment made in 2014, and it's rather complex, so I am afraid that but at least you can say in the quantum process, if you go down to the subatomic level, it seems to be, say, irrelevant whether or not time our, say, common sense, as you say, the arrow of time is going in one direction. In quantum processes, that is not the case. Without going into details about the experiment, you can see that it's somehow time is irrelevant for many of those phenomena occurring in the subatomic level.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's see if we can tie this in with the paranormal. Because, I mean, the first thing that immediately springs to mind, well, perhaps this explains things like ghosts, that they are existing in a different time frame to us when we see them.
Yes, just before saying anything about ghosts, just let me say the focus of my book, which is called A Short History of Nearly Everything Paranormal, is mainly on Psyche, which is the phenomena that are related to our human consciousness, which is basically telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, seeing the future, and healing and psychokinesis, moving, say, influencing objects with the power of mind. So that is my focus in the books. I don't, I say open to the possibility of ghosts, but I don't enter that sphere in a way.
Right. So let's get on to your book then, which I say has a wonderful title, The Short History of, and in brackets, nearly everything paranormal. Yes, that excludes the ghosts. But
well, yeah,
and UFOs and lots of things like that. Yeah,
it's still 500 pages, you know, so it's quite yeah.
Yeah, not that short a history then. So tell us a bit more about the book then, and the aspects you've focused on.
Well, I'm interested in, because I'm not negative towards aliens or ghosts or anything like that, but I somehow feel that in our day-to-day life, that is when you have, say, suddenly you feel some kind of pressure in the chest, and then you hear your favorite uncle has died from a heart attack in Canada. Is that just coincidental, or have there been really a kind of telepathic contact there? These phenomena, and also if you dream of something, I can take an example from my book. For instance, a friend of mine, he had been out drinking quite a lot, and when he was sleeping it off, he heard a voice telling him that an other friend, a named friend of him, was going to win the lottery. And you know, that's quite the Norwegian lottery. To win the first prize there, it's 1 to 5 million, the odds. So it's quite small possibility. And 14 days later, this named friend called my school friend and said, "Listen up, I've got something to tell you." And my friend answered, "Yes, I know. You won the lottery." And it was the case. He had won the first prize in the lottery, really. So how is that possible, you know? And I was interested in that aspect. Of course, all due respect to aliens and ghosts and all that, but I'm more interested in our, say what is called Lebenswelt in German, our lived experience in day-to-day life, and how the paranormal influences our daily life, and how it positively can be used also if you start to listen to your intuition, because my perspective is that our intuition can be informed by telepathy and can be informed by clairvoyance and by precognition, as was probably the case with my sleeping and drunk friend here.
Yeah.
So that is the focus of my book, really. And I have lots of stories how archaeologists have used clairvoyance to make spectacular finds and that kind of things.
Yeah. Then an angle really that is it your view that many of us have these abilities, but we bury them with day-to-day life and ignore them and just plough on our way and miss all these hidden psi messages?
Yes, exactly. I compare to musicality because I think just as everybody is a little musical. Of course, we are not Beethoven, and in a parallel, also we are not Jesus Christ or the Buddha. But still, we all have this, because it's not kind of say ego competence. It's connected to a consciousness with the big C, really, to which we are all connected, and that is the concept. What I in my book call the mental internet. Because if I go to a page, Facebook page of a friend of mine, I can see, oh, there he is visiting his aunt, and oh, there he is out at the seaside fishing and all that. It's not magic, really. It's the information is there on the internet. So if I go to the relevant places, I will be able to say find that information. And my idea of consciousness, which is not basically my idea, of course, because it's an extremely old idea, is that consciousness is basically a collective phenomenon. But I use the metaphor of the internet because it's for modern folks, that is our daily experience, is how we can be connected to people in Australia, for instance. But I think there is a parallel. There is this mental internet, and we are very often a bit, say, sloppy about how we deal with the information there. If you got a strong hunch, for instance, very often we tend to say, oh, that's just coincidence, and it's nothing to pay attention to. But that is not the message from many wisdom teachers in many traditions all over the world. So I think, say, doing meditation, going in nature, listen in, be more quiet, and somehow get the Fingerspitzgefühl, to use the German expression, to listen into those vibes. Then they can help you. Which job should you apply for? Should you take that phone? Should you hang out with those people? And so I think it's a guidance system that can be used much more efficiently than most of us do today.
Because obviously we're all guilty of overthinking things and reasoning out what is the best course of action, best in quotes there. It's not necessarily. And again, ignoring our intuition and gut feelings on something. Is there a danger, though, that you go too far the other way? That
yes.
You don't think something through and your intuition says, sure, I can do this, whereas your more rational mind would say, no, don't do it.
Yes, of course there is, and it's somehow these things is not kind of strict science when you apply them to daily life. It's a kind of the art of living. So you have to train your intuition, of course, also. And I am still a great adherent to using logic and all that kind of faculties. But you should complement your reasoning with more active use of intuition. It's difficult to make, of course, advice for this. But as I say, if, for instance, you have your right arm hanging at the side of your body in half a year, then it will not be very efficient. Your muscles will have somehow atrophied, and it will be very, clumsy to do any activity with it at all. And also with your intuition, if you don't use it, my chiropractor, he had a kind of funny T-shirt, and on the back it was written, use it or lose it. Mm-hmm. so I feel it's like with the intuition, you have to train your intuition, and then it will become more and more reliable, because you got the feeling if it is really trustworthy. And as I give in my book quite simple exercises. If you got a letter, for instance, before you open it, who is it from? What do they want? And who is winning the game tonight? And if you go to a holiday when the corona pandemic is over, you can try to imagine how will it look on the place we are going camping, and so try to use it actually and train. And say, I will not see if it takes you 3 months or a couple of years, but the quality, the taste of it, you will somehow acquire a sense of when it is trustworthy and when it's not.
You're saying that, as you say, the mental internet is out there, and all of us can tune into it.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any dangers in doing this?
Well, it's danger in living. So I will not say if you go reckless about anything, there is danger. There are dangers, of course. So, and some people have a quite natural, they just know that their gut feeling is there and they trust. And if you go to Fortune 500 company leaders in the US, there was a kind of inquiry. What do you feel is your most, valuable asset when doing business decisions? And overwhelming part of them said intuition. Of course, also business leaders do many mistakes, but somehow I don't think if you are going to if you're going in the wood, of course you can fall and break your leg and all that. It's somehow kind of, there is risk to everything. We'll just have to accept that. But as I said, if you use also reason, and if you have very strong paranormal experiences, some people have problems with that. They can feel bad things coming before them. I got a friend, and he drinks too much because he gets forewarnings about negative things. And that is not a good thing. So then I would say to him, go to a therapist and try to somehow integrate these things in your life. So there are dangers. Of course, we should not, especially if people are much into conspiracy theories, and so you can become quite paranoid about the whole thing. So that is not my approach, really. I think you should be very grounded and do that's the old Zen saying, I will try to, if I'm able to recite it in a good way here. They say, before enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water. After enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water. Yeah. So you have to be very grounded in your daily life and use these things in a sound way, and not forget to greet your neighbor and feed the cat and all these things that say our normal life consists of.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Give me some examples from your book of some of the skills people have exhibited.
An intriguing experiment I like quite a lot, and was eye-opener for me, was an experiment conducted by an English professor in psychology, Dr. Adrian Parker. He is tenured in Sweden, but he's English, and he did an experiment with two Danish twins, Sarah and Vicky, and they were in their 20s, and they had agreed to an experiment to test if there was telepathic exchange between them, because they had that experience quite often. And so what happened very often was one of the twins went to the shop and they come home with a blouse, for instance, and then the other twin came home a bit later with exactly the same blouse, and so they had agreed that those who had bought it first should keep it, the other had to deliver it back because it had happened so many times. So Adrian Parker made an experiment where they had agreed to one of the twins should be wired to lots of kind of instrument measuring, say, sweat response, heart beats per minute, and all that kind of, physical responses. And the other twin was in an other laboratory, and she had agreed to get 4 mild shocks. And the time for the shocks were not decided by any human, because that could somehow influence the experiment by expectations, both in the twins and in the researchers. So it was a computer who randomized, decided when these shocks was to be given. And what was really marvelous was that when one twin gets a shock, then the meters on the other twin spiked. And as I said, there were totally different physical rooms. So how is that possible? You give one twin the shock and the meters simultaneously on the other twin spikes. So clearly there is this connection between them, unless you take this experiment to just be kind of bogus or fake. There was a lie detector expert present, and also a representative from the Danish police. And Adrian Parker, as I said, is tenured professor in psychology. So for me, it is not really I don't think it's reasonable to think this is just fake,
Yeah.
So So that is I mentioned into this experiment to some detail in my book, and lots of other experiments like that. Yes.
Yeah. What about psycho or telekinesis? Because I mean, that's where I think a lot of people have experience of intuition, but actually moving things, that tends to be moving, to many people, that's heading into serious occult magic or something. What have you discovered on that?
Well, I mentioned a quite extraordinary case in a kindergarten in Lalm in Gudbrandsdalen in Norway that happened some years ago, and it's very well documented because all the person, not just the children, but the personal group also saw these phenomena happening. And that was a kind of poltergeist, heavy objects jumping into the air and sounds coming out of nowhere, and also suddenly small objects appearing out of the blue, and there were about 90 what is called occurrences of this kind, and some of them were witnessed as by up to 15 persons at the same time. So how can you explain that? And they called for a researcher, a quite famous Norwegian psychologist who has done lots of reports for courtrooms and the police and such. His name is Kjell Flekkøy, and he is a professor at the university, emeritus now, and also a professor at Oslo's greatest hospital. And he went into this, and his brother is a professor in physics at the university in Oslo, and he also looked into this. And they both concluded that these phenomena were, for the most part, physically real. So, and somehow, if you are a modest researcher, you somehow will not say, I have all explanations for this. So they conclude that, yes, the phenomena were real, but at the same time, we do not have a fully satisfactory explanatory model for them at the moment. And that also, as I said, one of those was a professor in physics. So we still have something to learn there, but there is a kind of exchange between consciousness and matter that we still not have completely understand. Mm-hmm.
Right. Now, another thing, I'm just looking at some of the notes I've got here. If you like, the acceptability of psi powers in the Western world is relatively recent, as opposed to there's always been people out there, mediums and the like, who've been doing it, but no one's been quite certain whether or not they were doing it genuinely or whether there were, various fraudulent tricks going up there. But in other cultures, these things seem to have been accepted for a far longer period of time. I mean, Eastern cultures, that's where Zen and various mystic practices that we now accept in the West, that's where they originated. What do you think is the difference there? Is it that the West went over to a fairly materialist culture, industrialization and everything, and somehow buried these more mystical, magical powers?
Yes, I think it's quite reasonable what you say there, that somehow you focus on say, the external world rather than, say, yoga culture. Of course, it's lots of meditation techniques, and Western person is not willing to meditate in a cave in Himalaya for 5 years, and so I think the Western culture have moved in that direction, but there have always been these, say, Freemasons and Rosicrucians and Hermeticism and all that kind of, say, esoteric traditions living also inside the Western culture. But, say, the main thing with the West is science and technology. And somehow then you say, I think if you come into a room, for instance, you have a flashlight and you direct it to that corner of the room or that corner of the room, in a way, the West has focused on science and technology and become extremely good at that. So, and that's just fantastic. So, but of course, then somehow you can forget the inner world where some of these phenomena seem to originate, of what we call paranormal or occult kind. Yes. Mm-hmm. But basically, I don't think there is not necessarily any say, contradiction between them. There is this famous British classicist, Frances Yates. She wrote a couple of books about how magic really was gave the, say, kind of intellectual foundation for modernity. There under also development of science and technology. Giordano Bruno in the Hermetic tradition, and also another book called The Rosicrucian Enlightenment. And you will see many, for instance, Isaac Newton is probably the most, say, famous scientist of this Western, say, paradigmatic kind, and he was very much into alchemy, for instance, and also into biblical prophecies. And also Giordano Bruno, very famous for this heliocentric solar system with the sun in the middle, not the earth. And he was a practicing magician and occultist. And also I can mention lots of other scientists as well. They were doing, for instance, Kepler, he made this formula for ellipses, and that the planets were not moving in circles but in ellipses. He made his living from doing horoscopes for nobilities. So it's more like, and now we have, as I said, I mentioned this group at Berkeley in the 70s, the fundamental physics group. They were trying to rethink our worldview in light of quantum physics, and many of those have also went into parapsychology. For instance, the founder of the group, woman, Dr. Elisabeth Reuscher, she went into quite a lot of parapsychology research. And also you mentioned the East. One of those most famous from this fundamental physics group were Fritjof Capra, who made this very famous the Tao of physics, where he somehow found that modern quantum physics in the West had rediscovered many of the secrets of the wisdom, spiritual wisdom traditions from the East. So as I said, there's not necessarily any contradiction here, in my view at least.
Yes, I think with Isaac Newton, I seem to recall reading somewhere that he actually wrote more about alchemy than he did about his quote-unquote serious scientific work.
Yes, and he didn't. That's entirely correct what you say. There are more pages about alchemy than he wrote about this, say, normal science. And not only did he write about alchemy, but he practiced alchemy each year from, I don't remember the dates, but some months each year, he did some kind of alchemistic experiment with burning this kind of, I don't know the English words for it. I have to study more English. Yeah, but there's apparatus used by alchemists to transmute base metal into nobler metals, eventually gold and such things.
Yes, and obviously it's now accepted that, as you say, modern science has at its roots alchemy. Yes, and it just moved away from trying to transmute metals and devise the elixir of life, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, but still, just to just make that, it's possible to make gold. You know, we know this with nanotechnology and all these kind of stuff. So it's possible to make gold, but the process is so costly that the gold you make is less valuable than what the money you have to invest in the process. But I think it was first detected by this physicist quite early in the 20th century, Rutherford. I think he was the first that tried to make gold, if I remember right. So somehow the alchemistic dream is still with us, but it's not having the focus of the scientists.
Yeah. And obviously the quest for the elixir of life, modern medicine is pushing forward on that to an extent.
Yes, and gene technology, creating artificial life in the laboratory. Is there a more occult thing than that? That has been also a part of alchemy. You know, if you read, homunculus. That's the created little man you can make in the laboratory, and also this Jewish occult tradition about the golem made by magic. This kind of clay man that was brought to life. So the concept of robot really is an alchemistical concept if you go to the history of ideas.
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? How
it is
the ideas. No,
yes,
I can see why that's your focus and why it grips you so much.
Yes,
because it's always one of those fascinating things. Where did the idea first come from? You know, it's one of the things
from magic.
Yes, no, but you know, when you read about archaeological digs, and they've found earthenware containers that have traces of alcohol, and this is the earliest known alcohol ever, and it's 7,000 years old or whatever. But the thing that always queers me: who thought, let's get all these rotting fruits, and then we'll drink the alcohol, drink the substance that comes off it, and it'll be all right. And
But probably it was just by coincidence, but some people have forgotten some kind of a grain, and it was raining and it became wet, and after it had been lying there rotting and fermenting for a couple of months, then the horse ate it, and the horse started to behave strangely, and so so that's probably very much coincidence in that kind of things.
Yeah, the one that always fascinates me is with edible mushrooms and toadstools. How did people work out which was edible and which wasn't? Or was that the end of the Neanderthals because they were working their way through the
well be the case.
The poisonous ones and wiped themselves out? No,
could very well be, but children, they always try to put the thing in their mouth, and starting, I ate that, and see what happens, and then they found out what happens and generated the culture for these things. I think much discovery is by coincidence, but to somehow preserve what you have learned from those coincidences, that is the real science about it.
In your work, how do you differentiate? I mean, you've cited various people doing research, and they're all academics with impeccable qualifications and absolutely nothing to gain by faking the results. How do you cope with all the bogus people out there, for want of a better word, the charlatans? How do you filter that out of all this? Because
that's a problem. I am very aggressive towards charlatans because I feel somehow they are dragging my work down in the drain. So I don't like charlatans at all. So what can I do about it, really? As I once learned on an American TV show, there was a woman who said, where there is cheese, there are rats. So of course, when they can earn money money of that. Yes. But that will be in everything. There are people practicing fake medicine. There are people practicing fake whatever. Really, there are fake businessmen luring you and people into their say snake oil projects and so. So that is the paranormal is no exception from the human race with all its weaknesses. So, but what can I do about it? For me, as I said, the paranormal is a very normal thing. It's basically our nature because it's a function of consciousness, which is the core of what we are, really. So if someone wants to use these phenomena, real or faked phenomena, for trying to steal other people's money, it's terrible. But I cannot do anything about it. I'm afraid, except somehow try to tidy up this field a bit, and that was tried because, as I said, when I grew up, I felt on the one hand you had people somehow believed all these phenomena came from God, and then you have all the Christians believing all coming from the devil, and then you have the skeptics say all is just bogus, and then you come to New Age people and said, oh, everything is true. So I try to somehow, there are at least, as I said, 4 ditches here. So I try to tidy up and see what do we got here and how can we use it constructively. So, and as you said, I quote quite a lot of scientists. I would like to mention an article. I think if people are really interested in this, of course they should read my book. But an article, very good one. The most famous or most prestigious psychological journal in the world is often thought to be the American Psychologist, and it is released by APA, the American Psychological Association. And in 2018, in the May issue, there is an article. It's called "The Experimental Evidence for Parapsychological Phenomena." And that is written by a professor in psychology called Edsel Cardenia. He is also tenured in Sweden. So that article, that is so excellent because, as I said, this is the most prestigious journal for psychology in the world. And for them to take in this, it's a stamp of hallmark of quality. So I think everybody should read that article, really, because Cardenia says, as I said earlier on with these Norwegian professors, that yes, the phenomena are real, but we have not reached a, fully satisfactory explanatory model for them yet. So, of course, and then the research have to go on. So I think Cardenia has both the openness and, the modesty when dealing with these phenomena. And as I said, also this being taken into the most prestigious journal in the world, that is really, a sea change in academia towards these phenomena. So everybody being seriously interested in this field should read that article, really.
Mm-hmm. And
am I talking too much?
No, not at all. No, it's brilliant. No, I'm loving this.
Okay.
Are there ways people can strengthen, enhance, improve their psi capabilities? I mean, one element is recognizing them and not just squashing them down, but are there ways you can actually strengthen it?
Yes, I think so. But as I said, one also had to be realistic. If you have some musicality and you go to a course and take piano lessons, you are being able to improve quite a lot, but you still will not become Franz Liszt or Keith Jarrett. So you have to be realistic about it. Unless you are very gifted from the outset, probably you will not become exceptionally psychic, but you can improve quite a lot. What I also found, I will get back to your point, but just to say, I talked to a couple of American psychics who had been having near-death experiences. One, they had been clinical dead, one by drowning and the other by a car crash. And after that, coming back from the hospital, they suddenly found they were able to, tap into this mental internet and read other people telepathically and all that kind of stuff. So the filtering mechanism was somehow shut brutally out of function by their being clinical dead. So somehow, if you also have a deep personal crisis, you can become quite psychic through that. And also, as some people experimenting with, for instance, ayahuasca or psychedelics, they will also tell you about strong telepathic experiences. But these are very dramatic ways, and I will not say recommending any of them just to get more psychic. So I would recommend meditation. Use a quarter of an hour, a couple of times a day for meditation. Then you will fine-tune your consciousness and more easily pick up those vibes if you are interested. Also, there are courses. I know some Norwegian psychics. They feel they have learned quite a lot from these silver courses. You probably heard about them. They learning somehow to control their brain waves, because this is also seem to be a kind of which gear you are in. You have different brain waves. For instance, now we are on beta, most likely. But if you read a good book and go into yourself a cozy evening, then you will be much more into alpha, and then you are much more open and receptive to those kind of vibes. And if you go even deeper into dream, to theta and to delta, the deeper levels, then you are probably even more open to this. So you can you can learn to some extent to control your brain waves by exercises in silver courses. So that's a possibility. But also these esoteric traditions have lots of techniques. I mentioned some of them in the last chapter of my book. But the basic thing, which is mostly good for you, both in a psychological and also even a paranormal way, is doing some kind of meditation each day, or eventually also yoga.
Yes, but with obviously the caveat you said that you can't spend 5 years in a cave meditating.
Most of us can't.
Just one final point. You've mentioned, because you're Norwegian, and you've mentioned Danish, Norwegian, Swedish sources. Is there something in the Scandinavian psyche that lends itself to this area of exploration?
It's difficult to say. Sweden have 2 professors in this field. In Norway have, in fact, no professor today. So academically speaking, we are not exceptional. But I think somehow, for instance, also during the pandemic, remarkably few Norwegians have died in the pandemic if you look demographically at it. And why is that? It could be many reasons, of course, but we live quite separate in a way. It's not big cities so much. And I think that might be kind of the clue to it, because if you are much in the nature, much in the wood, in the fields, that's much more silence. And somehow, if you are living in New York and it's honking on the cars and it's like being in a rock concert and trying to listen to classical music on an earplug at the same time. It's almost impossible, really. So I think that might be some of the Nordic mystical secret, that quite silent up here compared to many other places in the world.
That makes a lot of sense. Well,
okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll get the name right again, Terje.
Yes.
Thank you ever so much for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I wish you well for the future. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you a lot, Charles, and thanks for having me on.
Here's a strange story. I was recently contacted by a listener, the Reverend Lorelei Back, who read one of my articles about King John, that's Bad King John, in English history. What piqued the Reverend Back's interest, she, by the way, is a retired Methodist church pastor in Pennsylvania, is that she had a friend who was related to a certain William Longisbay, who was the 3rd Earl of Salisbury, as well as being the illegitimate son of King Henry II and consequently King John's half-brother. And unlike a lot of the people around that time, William was very loyal towards King John. Now, as it happens, I do know something about William. It's something I dug up during the course of researching and writing a book about the folklore and history of the area I currently live in, which is South Norfolk and the Waveney Valley. Now, this area in the Middle Ages was dominated by a family of Norman barons called the Bigods. And in fact, William's mother was Ida de Tosney, who, as well as being the wife of Roger Bigod, the Earl of Norfolk at the time, was the mistress of King Henry II. I know, it's like an episode of Game of Thrones. But now for the really weird bit. William Longisbay died in the year 1226. However, the rumour was that William was actually murdered by poison, and it's said that when his tomb was opened in 1791, the well-preserved corpse of a rat, which carried traces of arsenic in it, was found inside William's skull. So had the rat been poisoned and crawled away to die in William's tomb? Or had a healthy rat crawled into the tomb and eaten something it had found there that contained arsenic? I leave it to your own macabre imaginations to work out what may have happened.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints. 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now.
Now the clock is totally against us, so a big thank you to our guest Terrier Simonson. We'll be heading into the realms of espionage, spies and the Russian Revolution next week. But until then, this is Charles Christian saying thank you for listening in. Please join me again next time. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, folklore, and the paranormal. You can keep in touch with us online at www.urbanfantasist.com, by email to urbanfantasist@icloud.com, and on Twitter @urbanfantasist. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Goodbye.